G'day, another quick review today, standing in the with the car door open. This review is of Autometer Gauges and my experience with Autometer Gauges. I've had Autometer Gauges in cars since, I think the first set I bought was in 2000, and my first foray into Autometer Gauges was with the Auto Gauge series of gauges, which was their Autometer's cheap gauge alternative. And I ran that in my vehicle for a number of years before I sold it, and the gauges went with it, and I upgraded to a more expensive set of Autometer gauges with a white face to match the dash, and they've worked so well over multiple cars. I've continued to run Autometer pretty much exclusively since I got into modifying cars. This is my Ram 3500, and I've just fitted a set of Autometer gauges to this not too long ago. I've fitted a pyrometer, and I've fitted a temperature gauge for the transmission. Now, fitting the transmission sensor is covered in another video when I talk about how horrible the factory transmission pan is on this car. There's no drain plug, and you've got to get it off because you've got to adjust the bands and all this sort of stuff. So having no drain plug in is a real pain in the backside. But anyway, so the two gauges here, in the US, you've got lots of options. Autometer make a raft of accessories for this vehicle. You can dash mount it, you can roof mount it, you can mount it on the pillar, or you can mount it under the radio. The unfortunate thing for that, if you've got an Australian converted truck, and this is obviously in right-hand drive configuration now, is that if you mount it if you want to get the Autometer pillar from factory, it's going to mount it on the passenger side. So that's not a whole lot of good to you. If you get the dash mount, it angles it slightly to what would be in Australia the passenger side. The roof mount's the same, angled slightly to the passenger. Even underneath the dash, in the slot underneath the dash, it angles it slightly to the passenger side. So no good in a right-hand drive converted vehicle. What I had thought of doing is I've done many custom mounts before. You make them out of fiberglass, put them on a pillar, put them on a dash, put them under the radio. I had thought of doing that. My initial instinct was to put them under the radio. I decided against that because I really like the slot under the radio. It's the perfect size for my phone, and I find just naturally I get in the car, put the phone in the slot, and off I go, and I find that very convenient. Or you're chucking a receipt or something in there. I didn't want to lose my DIN pocket underneath my current double DIN head unit and the air conditioning controls. I wanted to keep the slot, so I didn't want to put it there. So I was looking for an alternative. The factory things from factory from Autometer, not factory from Ram. The stuff from Autometer would suit left-hand drive configuration, wouldn't fit. Would fit left-hand drive, wouldn't fit right-hand drive. What I came to find is they make a double gauge pod for the top of a steering wheel column, and that's what I went with. So I now have two gauges mounted on top of the steering wheel, on the steering column. And the really cool thing about Autometer gauges for Ram trucks, which I just think is an absolutely phenomenal idea, and comes from just selling a heap of it. These sell in massive numbers. The F trucks sell in massive numbers in the US, is that Autometer have a range of gauges that factory match the Ram gauges on the dash. They do this for Gen 3 trucks, they do this for Gen 4 trucks. You can get gauges and they perfectly match the factory gauges, which I think is really, really cool. Back in the day when I was fitting gauges to race cars and such, I was always looking for gauges that would perfectly match the dash, because I'm like that, a bit of OCD I guess, and to have them in a range just made to match this car is really, really cool. The downside is if you've got an Australian Ram, we're on Celsius here, and all the degrees that are shown on the Autometer, if you're trying to get temperature, they're going to read in Fahrenheit. They don't offer a Celsius option in other gauges. They do. They have metric gauges, but in the factory Dodge range, they do not. They only have it in Fahrenheit, and that's simply a case of they sell bugger all of these in a metric market. They're all sold in North America in the Fahrenheit market, notwithstanding Canada, but couldn't get them in degrees, could only get them in Fahrenheit. But anyway, it's going to tell me what my EGTs are, it's going to tell me what my transmission temperature is. So I found that really good. it's a different alternative. Now, I'll let you see it at the conclusion of this video. I'll try and position the camera such that you can see what I see when I'm driving along. It does block out your odometer. So you can see the odometer. If you lean forward, you can see the odometer. You can't see the odometer generally from just sitting there, but if you just move your head a little bit, you can. It doesn't obstruct any of the other gauges. Doesn't obstruct battery, doesn't obstruct oil pressure, fuel, the speedometer, or the tacho. All of them are uninterrupted. You get a good view of them. They do sit, forward of that, but they don't obstruct the view. I've actually found them very good. And, that gives you an extra 2 gauges to look at besides the factory 6. So you've got 8 gauges to pay attention to. But, you'll know driving one of these things along if you're worried about transmission temperatures and EGTs. That would generally come when you're towing a heavy load or you're going up a prolonged incline at speed and the car's really working. You'll know when you particularly need to take notice of the EGTs and the pyrometer. And you want to do a bit, if you're fitting one of those gauges to your car, and you're going to do some heavy towing, it'd be good practice to do some normal driving around without a load and get an understanding of where your temperatures are going to sit normally. When you put a load on them, you'll know how far outside of normal that they're sitting, and if, you'll be able to judge if that's a concern or not. So I found it pretty good. Annoying mounting though, really annoying mounting. Autometer would have been better off to make a replacement. This isn't a replacement for the factory steering column on the top of it. It's not. You put it on top. You either they give you some tape or they give you some little scrivets to attach it to the factory steering column top. I've used a different adhesive to stick it on there, but it does sit over the top. So you do get a lip. You get a lip between the top and bottom of the steering wheel cover fit together flush from factory. Now there's a little lip because this isn't actually sitting where the steering column cover sat, it's sitting on top of it. So there is a little lip. It's not a big deal. If you're being picky, that's a nitpick. And the other thing is the grain isn't right. This is a much coarser grain than the factory plastic, much coarser. So it does make it, if you look closely, you can tell that, it's an aftermarket piece. But having said that, it integrates pretty well. The ease of mounting it, and this wasn't very much. This was only I got it for about $45 Australian. You factor your time, I could have made it myself without too much difficulty at all. I've done that plenty of times before. But for $50, not having to do any work at all, it was worthwhile in my opinion, and everything just fits in perfectly. Boom, it's fitted in there, no problems at all. So nice little option if you've got a US truck in Australia. And if you've got an F truck, there are some people, I do know of one reseller in Australia that sells a replacement pillar for the 2000 to 2005 era F250s, where you can put a gauge mount in there on a right-hand drive vehicle. Wasn't able to find that for a Ram, but you also have to be careful with that, is that back in the day there was some conjecture from regulatory bodies in Australia as to whether that gave a potential impact spot for head injury, and such that some people have been pulled over for pillar pods and said that they're illegal. Get rid of them. This is behind the steering wheel. You're going to hit the steering wheel before you hit them, or the airbag will hopefully deploy and you'll hit that before you hit that, so that shouldn't be a problem. It's mounted securely. It's not going to come loose. It's not on the bonnet. There's if you put them on the bonnet, and that can be a pedestrian hazard. I've seen people pulled over for that, so you want to be aware of that. This should hopefully, it seems to comply with all ADRs as far as I can tell, so that should be an acceptable fitment in Australia. But it is an alternative. And the other thing is, with modern cars, like this is an 05, it doesn't have curtain airbags, whereas cars nowadays, they have curtain airbags, which makes fitting pod gauges almost impossible. I haven't seen anybody, and I might be wrong, I will happily stand corrected, but I haven't seen any aftermarket manufacturer who's made a pod gauge for a pillar that contains a curtain airbag. And that would make sense, because if the curtain is going to deploy, it's going to foul on the gauges or the aftermarket trim. If you do have a curtain airbag vehicle, don't go fitting pods to the pillar trim. That's a bad idea. Don't do that. look for somewhere else to mount it, and try and always carry out any of these sort of fitments in compliance with your local regulation and laws. But this to me has been a nice little fitment, pretty easy, and it's been a fairly simple way to get a pyrometer and a transmission gauge into the car. I hope this was useful. Thanks for watching. This is a pretty close approximation of what my view of the gauges are. This is pretty much what I see. I see a little bit more than this. In the video, I can see that I don't really see much of the odometer at all. I do see a lot more of the odometer than that. Like, it's really only a slight movement that allows me to see the whole odometer in here. It really isn't as, this really does show that it blocks it completely out. In terms of my driving position, it doesn't really. I would say it's more like that. That's what I see. That would be a closer approximation without the steering wheel and the top of the dash blocking out the numbers at the top of the dial. That's about what I see. I find it quite acceptable. Certainly none of the other gauges are blocked from my driving perspective, and I found it quite good. So that's what you can reasonably expect. As I said, I think that probably what you'll expect to see is something like that, where you can just see the odometer, you can just see where the transmission selector is, and I find that quite acceptable. So if that looks like something you can live with, then I hope this video was of use to you. Thank you very much.